show. Vamos a ver el Chicago Riverwalk. Ahora mismo está en 29, tranquilo. Un hermoso día, cálido para estar afuera. Pero para eso vine. Vamos a ver qué más hay. Hasta ahora, de las cosas que más me ha gustado de Chicago es que, a diferencia de otros viajes, pues yo trato de buscar, ¿verdad?, que cosas que ver, cosas que hacer. Pues por distintas razones decidí que este viaje iba a ser como que de vagabundo, ¿no? Yo iba a empezar a caminar y a caminar y a caminar, sin buscar así direcciones más allá de sitios de comer, porque pues un olfato no viene mal y un buen desayuno siempre es importante. Pero lo bueno es que tú sigues caminando, tú buscas un bonche de gente que esté caminando, vétele detrás y vas a llegar a donde tienes que estar. Así fue como llegué al Millennium Park, así fue como llegué al museo, al cual no entré, pero se veía bonito de afuera. Y así llegué aquí al Riverwalk. Así que hay que atrever a aventurarse. De verdad que sí, vale la pena. Y vamos a seguir viendo esto, que está demasiado chulo. Wow.
Excuse me? Can I just take a photo of us?
A photo of you?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Let me take a photo of you. Caminando por el río encontré un memorial de soldados caídos en la guerra de Vietnam. Dice que Chicago still remembers. Y se puede sentir la vibra del sitio. Vamos a verlo. todos los soldados caídos durante la guerra. No sé si son áreas de sentarse o esto es como un mini anfiteatro. No sé si hacen algún tipo de actividad, presumo que sí. Pero es parte de las cosas que te vas a encontrar en el Chicago Riverwalk. Y creo que acabo de ver que el Riverwalk tiene como 2 millas de largo, así que todavía nos falta. Vamos a seguir viendo. Bueno, me topé con un área del Riverwalk que está bajo construcción, tuve que subir de nuevo a la avenida. Pero miren qué vista. Qué bueno que subí a la avenida. Viendo muchos barcitos y no sé, con tanto frío yo creo que ya mismo es hora de ir a hidratarse un poquito. La verdad que las vistas son otra cosa. Veo que hay un river cruise, así que vamos a ver cómo es, a ver si lo podemos tomar, ya que está bien agradable en 29. No se diga más. Ay, my ticket. Así que vamos a coger el crucero por el río. Según me cuentan, te lleva río arriba para que veas todos los edificios. Luego regresa hasta el Navy Pier y tiene una duración de 1 hora. Así que creo que ya más o menos debo de ir a abordar. Así que nos vemos allí. Logramos montarnos en el barquito. Así que vamos a ver cómo es. El barquito, gracias a Dios, está bastante vacío y logré entrar bastante a tiempo y encontré el mejor asiento posible. Pero vamos a ver un poquito de lo que vamos a ver antes de arrancar. Hacia allá adentro vamos. Excited!
And if that name sounds familiar, that's because it's the same Wrigley as Wrigley Field and Wrigley Chewing Gum. The Wrigley building was opened in 1924 and was designed in a style called Spanish Revival. We'll actually see a couple of revival styles of architecture over the course of the tour, and that's because there was a period of time in American history when we didn't really have an architectural voice of our own, and so we often look to Europe and to the past for inspiration. In fact, the clock tower there of the Wrigley building is modeled after the bell tower of the Seville Cathedral in Spain. The next building we're going to talk about is very easy to identify because it is helpfully wearing a name tag. It's also on the right side of the river. It is, of course, the Trump International Hotel and Tower. This is the second tallest building in Chicago, and it is an excellent example of contextualism. Contextualist architecture draws inspiration from its surroundings. In this case, there are 3 setbacks going up the side of Trump Tower. That's where the building goes up, and then goes in, and then goes up again. And each of these setbacks corresponds with the height of a neighboring building. This first setback on the lower right there is the same height as the Wrigley building right next door. The second setback up there on the left is the same height as the Jewelers building, the very ornate domed building up there on the left side of the river. And the third setback up there on the right is the same height as AMA Plaza, the black box building, just around on the other side of Trump Tower. We'll all get a better view of that one as we come around the building. Now, Trump International Hotel and Tower was completed in 2009, and it was designed by a man named Adrian Smith. This is a guy who knows a thing or two about tall buildings, as he's the designer of the current world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And if you're curious how Trump Tower stacks up against the Burj Khalifa, you would literally need to stack it. 2 Trump Towers stacked one on top of the other would give you the approximate height of the Burj Khalifa. Next up, we're going to talk about those corncob-shaped towers coming into view up ahead on the right there. These are part of a complex called Marina City, designed by a man named Bertrand Goldberg. Now, Bertrand Goldberg believed that buildings should reflect nature, and in his words, there are no right angles in nature. And so we end up with those curvilinear modernist towers. Now, when Marina City was completed in 1968, the downtown area was still largely industrial and quite smelly, so there wasn't a lot of demand for residences in the area. Bertrand Goldberg's solution to this was a city within a city. This apartment complex featured amenities including shops and restaurants, a bowling alley, an ice skating rink, and a cinema, which has since become the Chicago House of Blues. Coming out from under the bridge here, if you look up to the right, you'll see that it also features a marina, so you can park your boats. And of course, there's a garage to park your car. Valet only, for obvious reasons. There aren't enough suspended tennis balls in the world to give you the confidence to park in that garage. No, thank you. Now, if we shift our attention over to the left side of the river, we're going to highlight a few buildings that I think incorporate time as an interesting architectural quirk, beginning with 77 West Wacker, this mirrored building with the white stone up there on the left. This is designed in a style called neo-classical, and breaking that down, you've got neo, which means new, and classical, which references the architecture of the ancient world, in this case, that of the ancient Greeks. If we look at the top of the building, we'll see if we get a better view of it as we come out from under the bridge here. You'll see that the top of 77 West Wacker looks a lot like the Greek Parthenon. So the inspiration for the building comes to us from the distant past, where the materials and techniques used were much more common in 1992 when the building was completed. Right next door to that, we've got this glass building with these cutouts going down the side here. This is 111 West Wacker, and those cutouts represent Chicago's canals and also contain patios, which correspond with the heights of neighboring buildings in another example of contextualism. But everything below that first patio there was originally part of a different building, the Waterview Tower, before construction was halted following the 2008 financial crisis. So the building was actually abandoned for quite a while. It was salvaged though. The stone exterior was replaced with plastic glass, and 34 more floors were added to be completed in 2014. So this building gets its foundation and some of its bones also from the past, from a previous building. Then moving 2 doors down from there, we've got this blocky building with those columns along the top there. That is the Builders Building. And the side closest to us was completed in 1927, but the extension out there on the right was completed in the 1980s, 60 years later. The designers of that extension, though, obviously honored the intentions of the building without outright copying it, almost like a call and response through time. And so if you've been following along, we've got a spark, we've got a start, and we've got a complete piece of art. All plucked from the past and used by designers to inform their present in what I like to call a quantum collaboration. Now up ahead here on the river is one of our many fixed trunnion bascule or Chicago-style bridges in the Wells Street Bridge. Chicago is home to the most movable bridges in North America, 37 in total. We are number 2 worldwide behind Amsterdam. Both the Wells Street Bridge here and the Lake Street Bridge over on the South Branch are double-deck bridges with the top deck serving our L trains, so-called because those platforms are elevated. So if you're visiting from out of town, keep your cameras at the ready. There is no more Chicago photo in catching the train crossing the river. If we look out here to our right, we're going to talk about this 2.5-acre facade and the building it belongs to, Merchandise Mart. Completed in 1930, it was the largest building in the world until the completion of the Pentagon in 1943. It's an excellent example of Art Deco architecture. It's got long vertical lines, the building's craft flooring and pinstripes. It's got deep inset windows to enhance that verticality, and it's got geometric ornamentation. You can see the diamond and chevron patterns along the bottom and the top of the building. Art Deco has come to represent the opulence and the optimism of the 1920s. Merchandise Mart takes up 2 city blocks. It has 7.5 miles of hallways, 3.7 million square feet of office space. It has its own L stop, and up until 2008, it actually had its own zip code. Now at this point on the tour, we make our first approach to Wolf Point. This is the location on the Chicago River where the north, south, and main branches of the river meet, and it is the historic center of the city of Chicago. Chicago was incorporated in 1833 as a wilderness outpost with a population of about 350 people. Over the course of the next 70 years, that population would expand to 1.7 million at the turn of the century, making Chicago one of the fastest growing cities in history. There's a few notable buildings here at Wolf Point, but the one we're going to focus on is up ahead, slightly to the left. Looks kind of like a pencil jabbed into the river frontier. This is 150 North Riverside, and the reason for its sort of V shape or Y shape down there at the bottom is actually the result of the limitations of the land that it sits on. The back 2/3 of that lot have active underground Metra and Amtrak trains that run beneath that. And the front side is subject to a zoning law that requires a 30-foot setback for any buildings built along the Chicago River. This is to ensure that the riverfront remains open and accessible to the public. Now, whenever you're building tall buildings, one thing that needs to be accounted for is something called drift. This is the tendency for buildings to sway in high-speed winds at elevation, which, by the way, should be considered a feature rather than a bug, because things that do not bend tend to break. We don't want that happening on the high-rises. It is, though, something that can be minimized or mitigated, and the way that 150 North Riverside accomplishes this is with something called inertial slosh dampers. There are 12 concrete tanks at the top of that building containing 160,000 gallons of water. When the wind pushes the building one way, the water sloshes back the other way, which helps to dampen that inertial force and keeps the building from moving too much in the winds. We'll discuss a couple of methods over the course of the tour of how builders manage drift. Now up ahead, beyond Washington Boulevard, is an area of the river that the other docents and I like to call Art Deco Canyon because of the massive Art Deco buildings on either side of the river. We're going to discuss the Civic Opera building up there on the left on a return trip. But first, in 2 North Riverside Plaza, coming into view just beyond the bridge on the right. Originally the Chicago Daily News building, this is one of the first skyscrapers in the world to include an open-air public plaza as part of its design, which also means it's the first building in Chicago to intentionally develop toward the river. It's another excellent example of Art Deco architecture. It's got those long vertical lines, it's got those deep inset windows, and it's got that geometric ornamentation. But the side of the building facing us here on the river also features bas-reliefs, or ornamental carvings, which highlight the history of journalism and provide a timeline of the written word. Now, for our purposes here on the tour, it also starts another timeline, and that's because this next section of the river, up ahead on the right, is actually a pretty concise illustration of architectural trends in the States. 2 North Riverside Plaza was completed in 1929, which is the same year that the stock market crashed, sending us into the Great Depression. Follow that up with World War II, and it'd be about 25 years before new buildings started going up again, and by the time they did, tastes had changed. Because when you compare the opulence of the 1920s to the austerity of the Depression and wartime, it's easy to see how a new generation of designers might want to move away from excess ornamentation. And so we enter the modernist era of architecture in the States. Gateway Centers 1 and 2, these black box buildings coming into view up here on the right, completed in 1965 and 1967 respectively, are excellent examples of something called black box modernism. They are stark and dark, simple and efficient, and like many modernist styles of architecture, they emphasize function over form. These are not meant to be beautiful. These are meant to be functional. This is a style that was popularized by a man named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, but these two were actually designed by the firms Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Their perceived habit at the time of imitating Mies's work here and other places in the city saw Frank Lloyd Wright refer to the firm as the Three Blind Mies, which is a little heady, but it's a pretty solid term. Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way, was a contemporary, a peer of Mies van der Rohe. We unfortunately won't see any of his work here on the river, but if you're dead set on seeing Frank Lloyd Wright's work in person, you could take the Green Line out to Oak Park to do so. Now, as we move past the black boxes of Gateway Centers 1 and 2, we approach the white box that is Gateway Center 3, also on the right. Completed in 1971, Gateway 3 is designed in a style called International Style, since buildings like this could be and have been built in cities all over the world without looking out of place. By cladding the building in stone, it softens the look of it somewhat compared to the stark black boxes, and it also makes it more efficient to heat and cool, since it doesn't have that exposed heat-absorbing metal on the outside of the building. The stone there provides a bit of insulation in that regard. Now, as we approach this final tick on the timeline portion of the tour, we leave behind the modernist styles of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we get an early example of contextualism in Gateway Center 4, this curved glass building up here on the right. Completed in 1983, the curve and color of Gateway 4 mirrors the curve and color of the river down below. And each pane of glass has a slight bulge in the center. This is done intentionally to provide the overall effect of reflections on the rippled surface of water. All of these design elements put it in strong relationship with the Chicago River. But if you're curious about your own relationship with the Chicago River, then look no further than the massive map coming up here on our left. That red brick mounted to the wall up there represents the location of this building on the Chicago River, essentially acting as a massive "You Are Here" sign. 300 South Minder was just an ordinary black box building at its completion in 1971, but it was purchased in 2013, and the new owners spent $800,000 to literally put themselves on the map. And you know what? Money well spent, because we're talking about them. So credit where it's due. Just beyond the bridge up ahead on the right is a massive building that some of you might recognize as Gotham City Bank from the opening sequence of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. In fact, when they zip line onto the roof of that building at the beginning of the film, they do so from Gateway Center 4. And at the end of that sequence, those school buses, they go the wrong way down Van Buren Street. Of course, it's all just some movie magic. This is not in fact a bank at all. This is the old main post office, completed in 1932. It was the largest post office in the world at the time, and for good reason, since Chicago was the center of the mail order catalog industry. Another excellent example of Art Deco architecture: long vertical lines, deep inset windows, geometric ornamentation. After over 60 years of service, the post office was closed in 1996. It was purchased 20 years later, and the new owners spent $500 million converting it into offices to reopen in 2019. Chicago was incorporated in 1833, but we're not going to see anything nearly that old over the course of the tour. You might be wondering why that is. Aside from your standard redevelopment, very common in many major cities, we've got another pretty good reason for that. That reason is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Now, this is going to be the most substantial bit of history that I'm going to throw at you on the tour, but I think it's important to understand how the Great Chicago Fire and the events that followed had a profound impact on the architecture of the city. Now, since this bit of history begins with the story of destruction, there's unfortunately not a lot to look at that goes along with it. However, I'm about to fit like 40 years worth of history into just 4.5 minutes. So if that doesn't impress you, well then at least it'll be quick. So the period from July 4th to October 10th of 1871 was one of the driest on record for the city of Chicago, with only 3 inches of recorded rainfall for the entire 3-month period. So when a fire broke out the evening of October 8th, in or around the barn of the O'Leary family at 137 West Tacoma Street, which is just a few blocks from us here. A number of things would work against the city of Chicago that would lead to devastation. First, 2/3 of the structures in the city at the time were made of wood. This was not a Chicago-only problem. In many rapidly expanding cities, there's not enough time or resources to do stonework and masonry for every building that needs to go up. And so you end up with a lot of wooden structures. In fact, many of the roads and alleys were also paved with blocks of wood coated in tar. The second thing that worked against us was good old-fashioned human error. It was a long, dry period, and the firefighters were understandably overworked. However, their response to the fire was timely. It was actually a mistake by a watchman on duty that sent them to the wrong part of the city at the outset of the fire, and it was initially allowed to spread unchecked. The third thing that worked against us was the weather. Many folks thought that the river would act as a natural barrier, at the very least preventing the fire from spreading too far to the east. Unfortunately, 30-mile-per-hour winds picked up from the southwest, flinging burning debris across the south branch of the Chicago River, igniting several structures on the east side. From there, the fire continued to spread to the north, where it left the river again at the main branch and ignited the roof of the city's waterworks. That building was destroyed. Those water mains dried up, and with them, any hope we had to continue fighting the fire. Over the course of 30 hours, the fire burned 3.5 square miles and left 1/3 of the city's population homeless. Now, in the days, weeks, and months that followed, aid poured into the city from around the country and around the world. But in addition to that, people came to Chicago to help rebuild. And some of those people were young architects. They wanted to leave their mark on the world, and we needed new buildings. One of those young architects was a man named Daniel Burnham. And just 22 years after the Great Chicago Fire, Chicago would host the 1893 World's Fair, or World's Columbian Exhibition, with Daniel Burnham serving as the fairground's lead architect. The fair took place in Jackson Park to the south on Lake Michigan, and it saw 27 million visitors over the course of the 6 months that it was open. Visitors who experienced the newest of the new, including the first dishwasher, the first Ferris wheel, the first hamburger sandwiches, and the first carbonated soft drinks. But they would also experience the White City, which was the nickname affectionately given to the fair's grounds. Now, the buildings built for the fairgrounds were designed in a Beaux-Arts style. This is a European revivalist style of architecture. They were not meant to be permanent, so they were constructed out of wood, but clad in a mixture of cement, plaster, and jute fibers, then painted white. But it was really the addition of the relatively new at the time electric lighting which inspired the nickname for the fairgrounds. Not only was the White City a functioning fairground, but it was also the first example on the world stage of something called the City Beautiful movement. This was a movement by designers and architects of the day who felt that beautiful, thoughtfully designed cities improved the quality of life for both residents and visitors. They did not see this happening in American cities at the time, which they felt were expanding too quickly and with too little thought. Daniel Burnham, the lead architect for the fairgrounds, would actually go on to co-author a principal document for the City Beautiful movement called the 1909 Plan of Chicago. This is a plan that detailed Daniel Burnham's vision to make Chicago a Paris on the prairie. It included improvements to the lakefront, the development of a regional highway system, the acquisition of outer parks, the arrangement of streets, and the development of civic centers. Now, not everything in the plan would come to fruition, but it would be a document that city planners would reference for decades, and we still talk about it over a century later. In fact, as we go through the rest of the tour, I will point to things we can see today that were part of that 1909 Plan of Chicago, so you can see the impact it still has within the city. Goodness gracious, it's a whole lot of talking. I'm going to take the opportunity here to hop off the mic. I'm going to grab a quick sip of water, because all that talking made me very dry. If you are feeling parched as well, please go visit Olivia down at the bar. She'd be happy to set you up with a beverage of your very own. Shortly after this turn, we're going to be heading back up north, at which point I'm going to hop back on the mic and we'll go back to talking about things we can see. I promise you that. Don't worry. Thank you, folks. look up here on the right, we can see this this curved building here. This is River City, and while it might not look familiar to us, it definitely has familiar themes, and that's because there are no right angles in nature. That's right, like Marina City over on the main branch, those corncob-shaped towers, this was designed by Bertrand Goldberg. At its completion in 1986, it was actually meant to be part of a larger complex of residences here on the South Branch, but River City was less successful than Marina City, and so the rest of that complex never materialized. As we come around the building here, you'll see that it does have residential balconies, but they're not here on the outside of the curve. This S-shaped building keeps those balconies tucked into the inside curve because the curve there acts as a windbreak, a very helpful feature in the Windy City. And here's the thing about that nickname. Right, the Windy City is a nickname for Chicago, first recorded about 1850, and it did originally refer to the wind coming in off of the lake and into the city. However, in the lead-up to the 1893 World's Fair, our civic leaders went around advocating for Chicago to host, and some people, New Yorkers, decided to co-opt that nickname to refer to the windbag politicians that they saw coming out of the city of Chicago. So it's really what the name has come to mean since then. While we're on the topic, by the way, it was also a New Yorker that called Chicago the second city because he didn't feel we were as good as New York, his favorite city. And they sure do love to deride deep dish pizza in favor of New York style, which is preposterous because they're very different and they're both delightful. So that doesn't need to be a fight. Having said that, I do have strong opinions about regional hot dogs. Don't worry, I'm not going to bother you with them here on the architecture tour. All I'll say for now is drag mine through the garden. Thank you very much. You're welcome to ask me for further details at the end of the tour. Coming up on the right there, we can see a tall building with a statue up at the top there. That is the Chicago Board of Trade. It's another excellent example of Art Deco architecture with, join along if you'd like, long vertical lines, deep inset windows, and geometric ornamentation. That is the last time I do that on the tour, I promise. Although I'd be willing to wager that some of you will take that home as one of your facts. The Chicago Board of Trade played the role of Wayne Enterprises in Batman Begins, and I know what you're thinking now, but that is not in fact a Batman statue on top of the building. That is a statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, as a nod to the agricultural futures that were being traded within the building. Quick reminder, you're welcome to move about, take photos. Please be mindful of sight lines though. We want to make sure that everybody's able to enjoy the tour while we're going through it. Now at its completion in 1929, the Chicago Board of Trade was actually the tallest building in Chicago, and it would hold that title for 35 years. But today, a different building entirely holds that. We look up here on the right, we can see this tall, dark, and handsome building here. Two structures built at the top there. That is perhaps the most famous building in Chicago. This is Willis Tower. Alright, nobody threw anything. That's a good sign. Now here's the thing, the reason I flinch when I say the name Willis Tower is because I'm always ready for a local to be on board, and while the Willis Insurance Company did lease the naming rights to this building in 2009, most Chicagoans insist that it be called by its former name, the Sears Tower. So that is the name I will be using for the rest of the tour. Alright, because many of you get to go home to your cities after this. I still live here. I can't afford to have the locals mad at me. The Sears Tower is 1,451 feet tall, or 442 meters, making it the tallest building in Chicago and the third tallest building in the U.S., behind One World Trade Center and Central Park Tower in New York. Now the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats, and yes, that's a real thing, defines the height of a building as the distance between the threshold of the lowest open-air public entrance and the top of the structure or permanent spire. And it's that last bit that causes some controversy for fans of Sears Tower, because those structures at the top of the building there, those are antennas. They are not spires. And as a utility, rather than an architectural element, they do not count towards the height of the building. If they did, then Sears Tower would still not be the tallest building in the U.S. One World Trade Center would still have its feet like 25 feet, can you believe it? If only the country were founded in 1750 instead. Now, as we pass by the map building here, you can look out to the right and see that Sears Tower looks to be made up of 9 smaller columns, all bundled together at the base. This is the method that they use to minimize drift. It's called bundled tubes, and it was developed by one of the building's designers, a Bangladeshi-born structural engineer named Dr. Fazlur Khan. Basically, each of those columns is itself a rigid tube, a framed tube that is built to withstand sideways or lateral pressure from the wind. By bundling several of those tubes together at the base, it provides additional strength for the entire building, which helps to reduce the amount of drift those top floors are subject to. But enough about the engineering. Let's talk about my favorite fact about Sears Tower. 2 individuals have successfully climbed Sears Tower. In 1981, a man named Dan Goodwin climbed Sears Tower in a homemade Spider-Man costume with suction cups. That's a real thing that happened. And it's somehow not the more bizarre of these 2 stories, because in 1999, a Frenchman named Alain Robert climbed Sears Tower with no equipment. He free soloed Sears Tower. By wedging his hands around the windows, he was able to complete the climb in 1 hour and 22 minutes. Yeah, a time I don't think I could beat taking the stairs. Now, before you get any wild ideas, please note that both Spider-Dan and the French Spider-Man were promptly arrested upon arriving at the top of the building. Alright, if you are after a similar thrill, I would like to recommend The Ledge. This is a series of 5 glass boxes sticking out of the 103rd floor observation deck of the Sears Tower, allowing you to step out and look down onto the city below. All of the adrenaline, none of the arrest record. The Ledge. By the way, those antennas at the top of Sears Tower, they're the same height as Gateway Centers 1 and 2. That's how tall those antennas are, which means that's what we lose when we don't count them towards the height of the building. And some would argue that they weren't part of the original architectural designs of the building, so they shouldn't count. I counter with, they've been there for longer than they weren't there. Right, so what qualifies something as being considered a permanent part of the building? I will not drop it. This is the hill I'll die on. And it's very likely, spoiler alert, that I bring it up again later in the tour. So be prepared for that. As we once again approach Art Deco Canyon, we've got on the right here the Civic Opera building, completed in 1929, just 2 weeks after the stock market crash, meaning that unfortunately the Civic Opera had to file for bankruptcy just a few years later in 1932. Today, though, it is home to the Lyric Opera and the Joffrey Ballet, second largest opera house in North America. As we pass under the bridge here and we get out in front of the building, you'll be able to see that it's designed to look like a throne. The opera house is in the seat of the throne, and there are offices in the arms and the seat back up above. I also read that the man who oversaw the design of this building intentionally made it so the back of the throne. The St. Regis was completed in 2020, and it is the 3rd tallest building in Chicago. However, it is the tallest building in the world designed by a woman. This was designed by Jeannie Gang of Studio Gang. In addition to the absolutely gorgeous nature of the St. Regis, it's also technically fascinating as well. And that's because the St. Regis uses 3 methods of minimizing drift, 2 of which we've already discussed. The St. Regis has inertial slosh dampers. There are 6 tanks at the top of that building containing 400,000 gallons of water. So when the wind pushes one way, the water sloshes back, minimizes that drift. The St. Regis also uses bundled tubes. These 3 towers are bundled together here at the base, which provides additional strength in the direction of the prevailing winds. And the final method, which we have yet to discuss, is called blow-through floors. If we look at the tallest tower, you can see those 2 floors up there that look unfinished. Those floors have no windows, no residences. They are open. So the wind can blow right through, which helps to relieve pressure on the windward side of the building. That is incredible. It's also incredibly expensive. For reference, the top floor of the center tower and the terrace above it were sold as a penthouse for $20 million. So when you consider what they can't sell those blow-through floors now, you get a pretty good idea of the cost of safety. right? Now, as the third tallest building in Chicago, it is of course shorter than the second tallest building, Trump International Hotel and Tower. However, if you were to pluck up Trump Tower and plop it right here next to the St. Regis, you'd be able to stand on the roof of the St. Regis and look down onto the roof of Trump Tower. And that's because Trump Tower has a spire, which of course counts towards its height. And I think you know where I'm going with this. We aren't allowed to count the antennas on Sears Tower. Antennas, which by the way broadcast radio and television signals. That's pretty handy. What does a spire do other than count? You see why I'm upset, right? I'll calm down for you all, but the next group is going to hear about it. Up here on the left, you can see a building out in the distance there that some folks have told me looks like a fidget spinner. Others have said it looks kind of like a drinks flask. Right? Both look pretty good. That is Lake Point Tower, completed in 1968. I think it looks lonely. And that's because for over a century there's been legislation preventing the private development of the lakefront, but there's always been an exception for the lake meets the river. And that's because of the necessary harbor facilities that keep a city like Chicago running smoothly. Now in the 1960s, that legislation went through some revisions, and they forgot to put in that stipulation that the exception was only for harbor facilities. So this created a loophole that our friends at Lake Point Tower were able to exploit. Now they weren't the only ones, but that loophole was subsequently closed, and in the 1980s the city straightened out Lakeshore Drive here above us, with the other buildings ending up on the inside of it, leaving Lake Point Tower as the only lonely high-rise outside of Lakeshore Drive. Which makes it very special. And so some notable figures have lived at Lake Point Tower, including Tom Cruise, Alice Cooper, and Scottie Pippen. Not together. I don't think they split rent. And just in case anybody's on board who heard the rumor that Oprah lived in Lake Point Tower, it's not true, it's just a rumor. She simply frequented Cité, the French restaurant that used to live in the circular structure at the top of the building. Unfortunately, Cité closed in 2020, early days of the pandemic, so it's no longer there. I have heard that there are restaurants that are looking to renovate that space. And I'm just going to tell you all right now, if a restaurant moves into that space and doesn't call themselves Second Cité, I am boycotting. That is too good a pun to just leave on the table like that. And of course, up ahead, on the left, we've got all these buildings extending out to the lake there. That's all part of Navy Pier. Navy Pier was constructed in 1916 and was called, at the time of its construction, Municipal Pier 2. Weird name for the first pier built along the harbor, I'll grant you that. Except that it was in the 1909 plan of Chicago to build 2 municipal piers.
He's gonna keep turning.
So they just got a jump start on that numbering system. Now, the Great Depression unfortunately put an end to any further development of the pier system, so we just ended up with the one, and it was renamed in 1927 to honor the Navy personnel that fought in World War I. As we turn this boat around, I'm going to hop off the mic, but before I do, I want to let you know the most important piece of information on the entire tour. All right, it may not seem like it now, but I guarantee you, in about 10 to 15 minutes it will. All right. Within about 5 minutes or so, we're going to be getting back to our dock at Michigan Avenue, at which point you will disembark the vessel, hopefully having had a great time on the tour. When you disembark, you will find very few public restrooms. Okay, but if you've got time right now, there are restrooms down below. Please feel free to avail yourselves to them before we get back to the dock. Thanks, folks. I'll be hopping back on as we head back onto the bridge, but in the meantime, enjoy those views. this point on the tour, as we head back towards our dock, I do like to make some recommendations. If you're visiting Chicago and you're looking for more things to do with your time, or perhaps you're a local looking for more opportunities to be a tourist in your own city, I've got some recommendations for you. Spoiler alert, it's all museums. I love a museum. I'm sure having listened to me talk for the last hour, this comes as no surprise to you. So my first recommendation would be to head about 10 blocks north on Michigan Avenue from the river. There you'll find a very old building called the Chicago Water Tower. Built in 1869, just 2 years before the Great Chicago Fire. And in fact, the neighborhood around the water tower was destroyed in the fire. But the water tower survived, and it's still there today. It's a beautiful old building and definitely worth a visit in and of itself. But it's also just a couple of blocks away from the Museum of Contemporary Art. So you can make an afternoon of it. See an old building and some contemporary art. That sounds like a great time to me. My second recommendation would be to head to Jackson Park in the south, which, if you recall, was the location of the 1893 World's Fair. Now, I told you that the buildings built for the fairgrounds were not meant to be permanent, but one of them was built with a brick substructure. The former Palace of Fine Arts was built in such a way to provide a safe place to house exhibits both during and after the fair, and that building is still there in Jackson Park. It is the current home of the Museum of Science and Industry. So you can head down to Jackson Park, get a sneak peek at the White City, and also experience an excellent museum in the Museum of Science and Industry. Then my final recommendation doesn't have a clever connection to the tour. It's just my favorite museum in the city. It is, of course, the Art Institute of Chicago. You're ahead a few blocks south on Michigan from the river. You would see a massive building, iconic lions out front. There's something that everyone would enjoy at the Art Institute of Chicago. You're going to want to set aside a pretty significant chunk of time to plan to visit that while you're here in the city, because it's just a lot to see. It's a big museum. It's also right next to Millennium Park, where you'll find the Cloud Gate sculpture, aka the Beam, so you can knock both those out in the same visit. Now, I'd also like to take the opportunity to talk to you about what we'll call the natural architecture of the region, beginning with the Great Lakes. They were formed over 14,000 years ago with the melting of a mile-thick glacier from the Wisconsin Ice Age. The Great Lakes hold 20% of the world's fresh water. That's 1/5 of all the fresh water in the world located in the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan was formed about 10,000 years ago. It is the third largest of the Great Lakes in area. This place where the lake meets several waterways, including the Chicago River, all of which abuts up next to expansive prairies to the west, made it vital for the native people that called it home. Chicago sits on the traditional unceded homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes, including the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Sac-and-Fox, also call this area home. Their travels can be seen today in the roads that cut diagonally across our city's grid, and their impact can also be seen in many of the names in the region, including the name of the lake, which comes from an Algonquin word, Michigami, which means great water. And then, of course, there's the name of the city itself. When the first European settlers arrived in this place, they found primarily wetlands in which ramps, a type of pungent wild leek, a relative of onion and garlic, grew
Es que
in
está como en
abundance.
27
Miami,
grados
Illinois,
y
word
la
for that
gente
plant was
está
Chicago,
brincando,
which
veo
the
gente
first French settlers
bailando,
interpreted as Chicagoa.
porque hace
So
un
that's how we get
frío
the name
bien.
of the city. So move over, Big Apple.
¿No me creen?
Right, you all are visiting the Wild Onion, which is a much better nickname in my opinion. Now, as we come into our dock, I'm going to go ahead and ask everybody to go ahead and find a seat. Wherever you are is fine. We just want to make sure that everybody is sat down as we come into the dock. Things can get bumpy. We do not want you or your personal effects to end up either going in that cold water or taking any spills on these very hard steel decks. Both of which are guaranteed to ruin a vacation, right? So I want to make sure that everybody is sat down as we come into the dock here. Now, once we are fully docked, I'm going to be the first one off the boat, but I'll be waiting at the top of the stairs there. So if you've got anything for me, questions, manifestos, or even just declarations of love, whatever you've got for me, I'll take at the top of the stairs. Now, at the beginning of the tour, I don't know if you remember, I set out with a goal. I wanted each and every one of us to learn 25 new facts about the city of Chicago and its architecture. So with that in mind, how do you think we did? 25 facts.